Welcome, everybody. My name is Cynthia Holt, and I am the Executive Director for the Council of Atlantic Academic Libraries. Welcome to today's session, Introduction to Accessibility and Open Educational Resources. A few housekeeping things to start. We ask that you please keep your camera off and your mic muted during the session. We have some folks coming in from low bandwidth areas, so that'll help optimize their experience as well. We will hold questions to the end, but you can put them into the chat during the session. We will be monitoring the chat. If you want to unmute yourself and turn on your camera when you ask a question during the Q&A, please feel free. That would be wonderful. And just to give you a heads up, we are recording the session and it will be posted to the CAAL YouTube channel likely tomorrow. And I will send out a message to everybody who registered for this session to let you know when the recording is available. And with no further ado, I'd like to acknowledge that CAAL-CBPA members sit on unceded and traditional territories of the Mi'kmaq, Beothuk, Inuit, and Wolastoqiyik, and the Pescatamu-Cuddy peoples. Treaties of peace and friendship were first signed in 1725 between the British Crown and the Mi'kmaq and the Wolastoqiyik peoples. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but recognized Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik title and established the rules of what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. We acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the first peoples of this region, and we express our gratitude as guests on this land. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Alexandra Marcaccio, who is the AtlanticOER lead, and she will be leading us in this presentation this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia. I'll go ahead and share my screen. I've got some slides for us all to follow. There we go. Just going to take a minute, and now you should all see that. So, hi everyone, and welcome to this introductory session on accessibility. Today, I'm going to be taking you through some of the basics of accessibility and what to consider in terms of accessibility when we are making OER. So, bit of an agenda for today. So first of all, we're just going to talk about why accessibility, specifically why accessibility in OER, why it matters. Then we're going to get into some of the different elements of web accessibility. The reason we're focusing on web accessibility specifically is because most OER are hosted on the web. And so a lot of the elements that we think of when we think of general web accessibility do apply to OER. Then we're going to take a minute and look at implementing these accessibility considerations into Pressbooks. We're using Pressbooks as a case study today to just kind of see how you actually go about taking the principles and these elements that we know of in terms of accessibility and then actually doing this work in Pressbooks, especially since implementing some of these features in Pressbooks, I do acknowledge, isn't always the most intuitive, isn't always the most clear. We may know, for example, that you need alt text, but it might not be clear how you actually go about doing that in Pressbooks. So I want to give you a couple tips on doing this work. And then at the end, I'm going to take you through some resources that will actually support you in your accessibility journey. And I will be sharing the slides with Cynthia, and those resources are hyperlinked. So if you download a copy of these slides once they're available online, you'll actually be able to get into all of the resources and websites that I'll be talking about today. So first, what do we mean when we talk about accessibility? What's going on with accessibility in OER? So when we think about accessibility, we're thinking of that set of principles that could be used to make a resource easy to access, easy to work with or interact with, and easy to actually comprehend and understand to all individuals regardless of their ability or disabilities. And much of accessibility in this context goes back to what we know in terms of the universal design for learning principles. So that focus on flexibility, on removing barriers and providing all students, all learners with that opportunity. So why does it matter? When we think about course materials, and especially with OER, often the first thing we think about is affordability. So students' inability to maybe afford their course materials if they're using traditional commercial options and how that creates a barrier to learning. But there are other barriers to consider. Students with different disabilities encounter other challenges when accessing course materials. So for example, if again, they're using a commercial textbook, if that commercial textbook isn't an option that is not screen reader friendly, then they're not able to read it even if they can afford it. And those same issues can still apply with an OER. Theoretically, if an OER wasn't screen reader friendly, even if it is free for a student to access, they still can't truly access the materials. And one of the core values of open education is this idea of diversity, inclusion, accessibility. When we look at literature about OER, a lot of what is talked about is the potential for OER to kind of go beyond what traditional course materials do. Another thing to think about is the actual policies and guidelines and legislations in this country. So many provincial governments have laws, policies, and other plans for improving accessibility. So I know for folks who are coming in from Nova Scotia, there's the Nova Scotia Accessibility Act, there's the Government Accessibility Plan. And I'm sure if you were to do some research and look into the province that you're coming in from, you'll find similar policies and plans potentially that might actually dictate expectations for accessibility. Another thing that can be useful to think about is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which we formally call WCAG. This is a set of guidelines and principles for making web content as accessible as possible. It goes over in a lot of detail the different elements of accessibilities and how you should be implementing it. And so going back to those provincial policies I just mentioned, there are multiple provincial governments that do ask that web content, and in this case, since OER are hosted on the web, that OER generated meet current WCAG standards. So WCAG has evolved over time, and our current standard right now is WCAG 2.1. And I'll be linking to that later in the resources so that you can check it out in more detail for yourself. We don't have time to go over everything today. So let's think about the different elements of accessibility. We're going to start very basic today. This is meant to be introductory, so don't worry if you've never considered accessibility before. We're starting at the building blocks. So first, let's think about the actual content in a book, so content organization. This is a general best practice for websites, and it applies to any sort of learning resource as well. You don't want to see very large blocks of text. You don't want to see extremely long paragraphs. You want to be breaking down your content into manageable and shorter paragraphs. Another thing to consider is the actual language that you're using in your writing. So we want to use plain language as much as possible. You want to avoid jargon. However, we are educators. We understand that sometimes that jargon can be necessary. So if it is, you can provide definitions for any technical terms. And glossary features are a really way to organize that so a student has a resource to look at so they can understand the terminology you're using. And then in terms of the organization of that content, we want organization to be logical, so for things to flow in a manner that makes sense. So for example, if you were doing something with history, breaking things down chronologically, breaking down your content from large concepts into kind of smaller sections and subsections, using headings to really break down that content and show the organization, that sort of thing. And then with organization, there's also a technical feature you need to be using, which we call styles. This is what we mean when we're talking about your heading 1 and heading 2 that you traditionally see in a Word document. You want to make sure you're using that to mark any new sections and subsections. These are necessary for a screen reader. So for example, let's pretend that this slide is a bit of content. And so content organization is the title of this slide. We would want that to be marked with an H1. And let's just say, for argument's sake, that content and organization were my two subsections. We would want content marked as H2, and the same thing with organization. What this does for a screen reader, actually, when a student with a disability or someone using a screen reader interacts with this, is it will actually read out the headings first so that a student can then figure out where they want to go in the text. So it'll read content organization and mark it clear as the main heading for the page because it has the H1, and content and organization, which have H2s, would be seen as subsection headings because they have that H2 tag. So what it's doing is telling someone who's using that screen reader what each bit of word, what each word represents. Otherwise, if you didn't have those in, it would just start reading this and it would almost sound like a book that is just going. So it would say content organization, content breakdown, content. See what I mean? You lose that kind of structure that is here. So you need to be using styles to make it clear what the structure is. So next is images. Now, when we talk about images, there can be two different types of images. So the first is decorative images. These are images that aren't actually enhancing the meaning of the text. They're not illustrating a concept. They're just here for aesthetic purposes. Maybe they're there for branding purposes. So a good example is actually on this slide itself. It's the AtlanticOER branding that we see in the top left corner of this slide. That is not giving any additional information about the content of this slide. This slide is about images, and this isn't really adding anything. It's not a diagram to differentiate between decorative or functional images. It's there for branding purposes, so it's a decorative image. Then we have functional images. These are actually conveying key information to readers. These are diagrams, figures that actually contribute to the overall meaning of the text. So we want to make sure we differentiate between these two because they become relevant later when we think about alt text. But in general, some principles for images. So ensure that the meaning of the image doesn't rely solely on color. So in order, for example, to read the AtlanticOER branding we see in the top left corner, I don't have to know that the top of the E is red, the middle of the E is blue, and the bottom of the E is yellow to understand that that says OER. That's not necessary to understanding the image. If there is color, say, in a pie chart, we don't want that to be the only way to understand the different sections of a pie chart. We need to make sure there's some text in there. So the meaning should not rely solely on color. Another thing to consider is good color contrast. So if we use that image of a pie graph, for example, again, if you were using 4 different shades of blue, that's really not going to have the color contrast you need. And so for some folks, the pie chart will just look like a slip or a full circle instead of having those distinct sections. Another thing is to ensure that your image is high resolution. We don't want anything blurry. So again, going back to the AtlanticOER image in the top left corner, the lettering of Atlantic is very clearly marked. It's very clear. There's no blurriness there. And then another thing to consider is the size of an image. So if the image is conveying meaning and is very text heavy, is it large enough that the font is big enough that someone can actually read it? So then we get into whether or not an image needs alt text. So for folks who may not be familiar with alt text, that's just a written description using words of an image. And what that does is it allows screen readers to describe a content of an image to a reader. So it's taking a visual element and turning it into text. What needs alt text? Any functional image. So any image that is contributing meaning to the text. The decorative images don't actually need alt text, and there are ways of marking decorative images. So most software and programs have methods where you can actually go in and mark a decorative image as such. If for some reason the platform you're working with doesn't have a way of marking an image as decorative, you can just write alt text that says decorative image. And so if it has been marked as decorative, the screen reader will be able to pass over the image when reading out loud. It won't get bogged down by it. So again, to use this slide as an example, as I've mentioned, the AtlanticOER logo is a decorative image. And so if you were to actually go into the back of my slides, you would see that I've marked this image as decorative. What that means is when the screen reader reads this page, it's not going to try to read out or describe the AtlanticOER logo. It's not going to see it as an image missing alt text. It'll just pass over it as if it's not there because it's not relevant to the meaning of what's going on in this slide. So we all know that you need alt text, but how do you actually write good alt text? First, you want to sit down, look at your image, and determine the purpose. So ask yourself, why did you include the image? What is the main message of the image? And what is the key information that is being displayed? This is important because this might mean that you don't actually describe every last little bit of the image. You want to focus on the key information. So when you're writing the description, you're going to be highlighting that purpose, highlighting that key information. A good rule of thumb is to use about 1 to 2 sentences to do an image alt text. Don't get overly descriptive. Make sure that you're skipping over details that aren't relevant to your purpose. I do understand that for especially complex figures that some of you might be using in educational resources, you might need a longer description. You can always do that. There are alternate ways instead of using alt text, or maybe you say in the alt text in the caption, and then you can put a caption under the image where you can go on for several sentences. Really does depend on how much information there is. But because we're really just focusing on the key information or the purpose of an image, this actually means that sometimes the same image can have different alt text depending on your purpose. And we're going to look at an example right now. So this is a screenshot that I took of the grants page of the AtlanticOER website. I might be showing this image for a couple reasons. So for example, I might be showing this image to show folks where to go in order to actually apply for the OER grant. That means that the bulk of my alt text is just going to focus on describing how to navigate to the Apply for the OER grant button. But in another case, I might be including this image in a different scenario to show the timeline for the 2025 cycle, which is actually in the text itself a couple lines in. So in the first case, if I was really just focused on showing where the button is, the alt text might say, the grants webpage of the AtlanticOER website. In the top left corner, there's a navy blue button that can be clicked on to apply for the grants. See how I've not mentioned the accessible applicants button? I haven't mentioned really any of the text because that stuff is irrelevant to what I'm trying to describe. I'm just trying to get folks to go to the grant button. But if we were to go with that latter example, if I was trying to direct people to information about the timeline, I might start with a similar first sentence. So the grants webpage of the AtlanticOER website, but my second sentence might say something like, in the second line of text, the timeline for the 2025 grant cycle is described, with grants recipients being notified in mid-March. So again, I'm ignoring the two buttons at the top, I'm ignoring the text at the bottom, and just focusing on describing what it is I'm trying to get users to get out of the image. And that's the real key with alt text, is focusing in on your purpose and only your purpose. So next is hyperlinks. So often we might, when creating an OER, want to include other resources, might want to redirect folks to other web pages. So a few things to consider when you're writing the text for hyperlinks. So the stuff, if you look at the example at the bottom, that is the actual text that you would click on to go to a hyperlink. Don't be using phrases like here or anything that's very vague or undescriptive. What we want to do with that text is describe what the hyperlink is that you're sending the reader to. Reason being is that if a screen reader were looking at this and it just said here, it would just, the screen reader essentially say something along the lines of hyperlink here. That's not telling the individual much about what the hyperlink's actually doing. So you want to make sure that you're kind of actually describing it. Another thing is highlighting any unique file formats. So it's one thing to redirect folks to another web page, but perhaps you want to redirect them to a PDF or another resource that's not just a simple web page. You would want that in the hyperlink text. So if we were to use this example, I am linking actually to that very web page that I just showed you in the previous slide, the information about the AtlanticOER development grants. So because that web page is all about info about the development grants, I have made my text say information about AtlanticOER development grants. But say, for example, I was sending them to a PDF with that information. What I might do is put square brackets at the end of this and write PDF in the square brackets and include that as part of the hyperlink, just so folks know that they are going to be redirected to another format. So they know that they would be leaving a web page and entering a PDF that they might be able to download. This is especially important to consider because certain text format or file formats like PDFs aren't always screen reader friendly, so you might want to give them the heads up so that they know that there might be something different about where they're going. Next is tables. So first things first is you want to be very selective about when you're using tables. So you don't want to be using tables to summarize any descriptive information. They really should only be used to display organized data, so survey results, that sort of thing. Another thing is, I know sometimes folks like to have the split or merge cells, so not say have it be a clean 3x6 where there are always 3 columns and always 6 rows or something. You want to make sure you're trying to have the same number of rows and columns throughout. Reason being that split or merge cells can sometimes interfere with a screen reader's ability to read the table. If again, like for some reason you have to include a table that has really dense information in it, it is possible for you to include written descriptions. Maybe you put a caption under the table that describes what's going on in the table, summarizes the key points of the table, almost the way that alt text does, and that can be useful for denser information. But in general, and later on I'm going to actually show you how to do this, You always want to include a caption for your table, which is just the title of the table. You always want to include headings. So when we think of a table, we know that often there's, headings for the top row that'll describe what kind of data you can find in the columns. You need to actually mark which ones are the titles/labels versus the actual data, because otherwise a screen reader won't know how to interpret your table and will see every cell as data rather than some cells as being headers and some being actual data. And then finally, this is also just general best practice, avoid making your tables too crowded with text. So make sure you have a good amount of white space around all the data. You don't want things very crowded. Next, media content. So we know that any kind of media can be embedded in OER, can really enhance the learning experience, but there are some things to consider to make sure that any media is accessible. And you really should consider this whether you're the author of the media that you're adding or whether you're sharing a resource that someone else has created. Media is a large category. We do not have time to go over everything, but in general, some features to look for is transcriptions or closed captions for video and podcasts, so audio content, good captions and alt text for infographics, and if possible, this is really great to have. If there's any audio content, if it has a speed up or slow down feature, that's really great because some folks actually do prefer to have the content sped up. That helps them with focusing. But then for other folks who might have auditory processing issues, they might actually want that slowed down a bit. In general, YouTube videos come with this feature. So if you're linking to YouTube, typically you're safe. And then finally, what I'm calling aesthetics. So this is things like your font and your colors. So font, make sure you're choosing an accessible sans serif font. Sans serif fonts is a category of fonts that don't have the little kind of like flicks and decorative elements to them. Those are more accessible. And then there's something that you can do called the IL1 test. So what you want to do, and it's right there, is you type in a capital I, a lowercase l, and the number 1. These are all characters that sometimes in certain fonts can look identical. And so it can make things very difficult to read. But as you can see here, the capital I is a little bit shorter than the lowercase l, so there's a bit of distinction there, and the 1 looks completely different. So we're not quite as concerned about character differentiation with a font like this. If you're not sure, you can always just type those 3 in with a font you're considering and see how it looks. And then of course there's color contrast. We need to make sure that you have good color contrast. Something that's important to note, and this is something I know from experiences I've had actually working with students with disabilities and having them test different resources, and there are color combinations that actually can technically pass color contrast standards, but still can be inaccessible. So a really common one is anything that is a light version of a color with a dark version of a color. So light gray background, black text, that is all kind of part of the same tonal family, but just different shades. Even though in a color contrast checker, that actually does pass accessibility standards, for most folks, it is still just unreadable. Same thing with darker gray and white. Again, they're on the same thing. This would happen potentially with light blue and navy. So anything within the same family can often, even if it's passing color contrast standards, can still cause issues. And if you're unsure about whether or not the colors you've chosen actually do meet color contrast standards, you can always use a color contrast checker. And in the resources later, I'll be linking to one that I typically use. So we've gone over a lot of different elements. Now, how do we put this all into Pressbooks? So that's not an exhaustive list of things to consider, but how do we actually go about putting some of these things into Pressbooks? So first, adding alt text, because this isn't necessarily intuitive. So when you are uploading an image to Pressbooks, you're uploading an image to the image library before you then embed it in your book. That is the moment where you can add alt text. So, and I'll do a live demonstration later if folks would like. What you will be doing is you hit the add media button, you go and you select your image from your library. In the bottom left corner of that, or bottom right corner of that panel, when you're confirming the image, there's a space there to write alt text. And this is when you can add it, is right then and there before the image even gets into your resource. Another thing is you can add alt text proactively. So if anyone on this call has a Pressbook that they're realizing maybe has a couple images missing alt text, you can retroactively add alt text. So what you'll do is you'll go into the chapter that has the image, you'll click on the image that's been embedded, and you'll open the image toolbar. There is an edit button, that's the little pencil button. And then when you open that up, again, you'll see that similar interface that existed when you uploaded the image in the first place. Go to that bottom right corner. There is a space for alt text, and you can add your alt text then. Next is tables. So you first need to make sure you mark your row and column headers. And I will be taking you into a fake Pressbook I have made so we can do this together. But you'll be highlighting your column or row headers. You'll do this one at a time. And then you'll go through the steps I've outlined here of clicking on the table icon, clicking the cell and table cell properties, and then you'll be able to change the cell type to header cell. Again, this does something similar to what would happen if you were to mark something as H1 or H2, where it marks it as a type of header. And then you'll set your scope depending on whether it's the entire row that you're looking at or the entire column, and you'll save it. You also want to make sure you're adding a caption and white space. So again, you'll go to the table icon, but this time go to table properties instead of table cell properties. You'll check off that you want a caption, and it'll open up a text box above the table where you can add your caption, and you'll type it in later. And then you'll adjust the white space using cell padding. This is done in pixels. I can't necessarily sit here and give you an exact number of pixels to use. This usually comes around to playing with it a little bit to see what actually works. So if you feel that the text is a bit cramped a bit vertically, you can add some cell padding that way. If you feel that, it's fine as is, you can leave it. But this often comes to a bit of trial and error and just editing and seeing what happens. Another thing which I didn't talk about earlier, but is important to consider, is equations in math. I know some folks, obviously, depending on your discipline, you will have to include equations. In general, MathJax is the best option when it comes to Pressbook. Reason being that LaTeX, at least in Pressbooks, is not screen reader friendly. So what you will do, but don't worry, you do not have to learn a new language. All you're going to do is go into the plugin sections, turn off Quick LaTeX, which automatically sets things in LaTeX, and then you'll add the equation using the syntax that I've put here. So essentially, square bracket, LaTeX, square bracket, your equation, and then the square bracket, backslash, LaTeX, square bracket. What this is doing is it's just letting Pressbooks know that you're putting in a LaTeX equation there, but then it'll convert it to this version called MathJax that makes it screen reader friendly. Another option is the language MathML. This is a screen reader friendly markup language that can be added to the text view of a chapter. But I do understand that not all folks are going to be comfortable with this because it does require learning another language. And that's why MathJax is typically considered the best option, because you can continue in LaTeX. If for some reason all of this fails, the absolute last resort would be making the equation using LaTeX, making it into an image, and then embedding the image and adding some kind of alt text that describes the equation. It is not clean. It is absolutely not the best method to be using. You should be trying one of the first two, but it can be done in worst case scenarios. And then another thing to consider in Pressbooks is H5P. I also do not have a clean answer here. So H5P, for folks who don't know, are all those interactive elements that you're adding to a textbook in Pressbooks. So this is your quizzes, your matching games, your drag and drop, that kind of thing. It's important to consider this because not all H5P is accessible. So some things to think about with H5P, yes, it's screen reader friendly, but you might be thinking about keyboard navigation. So if you say needed a mouse to do something like drag and drop, can you do it with just your keyboard? These sorts of things. At this moment, not all H5P is accessible. However, H5P over the last few years has been continuously improving and has been making changes to make some of these different content formats accessible. So you really kind of just have to stay up to date. So if you're considering adding H5P, I do recommend doing a bit of research and looking into the specific element type that you want to add to ensure that you're adding something accessible. Unfortunately, it's not clear on the website where this is. So in order to find this information, what you're going to have to do is go to the H5P website, which I've linked in this slide. You're going to search the key term accessibility. It will generate resources. So it'll generate a page that I'll link to later that goes through every different type of H5P activity, how accessible it is, when it was last updated, those sorts of things. You can also sometimes find forum discussions. So if for any reason you thought that an H5P item that you added in was accessible and now you're getting feedback that maybe it isn't, the forum is a place where you can troubleshoot a bit. So these are resources that are out there for you. Unfortunately, yes, it does take more work to consider H5P and accessibility, but it is work that is absolutely worth doing that you should be doing, and there are ways around it. But in general, things to look for is any kind of alt text that could help someone navigate it, the ability to use keyboard navigation. So what I mean is, if instead of having to use like an actual computer mouse or a trackpad to do something, can you use just the keys of a keyboard to get through the item? And then good color contrast. Again, that's a visual element. It's a lot of this. Basically, you're looking for a lot of the same things that you would in terms of the general elements of accessibility. So in conclusion, and then we'll take a few minutes and go into a Pressbook, but just a few things to leave you with. Making OER accessible is just a part of the values of open education. Accessible OER, I know often we think accessible OER, we think free to access affordability, but accessibility really does go a lot far beyond affordability. There are so many elements of accessibility to consider when creating any resource. I hope that today will get you started with some of that. And again, we're going to go into Pressbooks in a minute so that you can actually see this done live. But in general, Pressbooks is not the only platform out there, and I know that, but this is just the one I have expertise with. But you want to just become familiar with whatever platform you're using to host the OER so you can actually implement these features. So some resources to consider before we go into an actual Pressbook. So the first link I've put in here is the current WCAG standard. So that's WCAG 2.1. Next is a color contrast checker. This is the one that I use. You'll input the hex codes of the two colors you'd like to check the contrast of, and then it'll generate a report about that. Next, which is very useful, and we can try out because I have it on my computer, is an accessibility plugin for your browser. This is a free browser extension, and when you turn it on, it'll do a quick accessibility report, and it'll actually highlight things on the page. So you'll be able to see like, oh, this is an accessibility feature that's on this web page. So it'll pick things up like those heading and style tags that we talked about. It'll also flag any issues. So for example, let's just say with this slide, if I ran this through accessibility checker and I didn't have this marked as a decorative image and there wasn't any alt text with the AtlanticOER logo, it would flag that as an issue. Next is a LibGuide called the Accessible Pressbooks Guide. This is the guide that I wrote in consultation with accessibility experts when I formerly worked at the University of Guelph. So this has been vetted by other accessibility folks. There's also an accessibility toolkit by BC Campus, which goes into even more detail than I can in a short webinar like today. And then the final one, this is only relevant right now, so make sure you're always checking, but this is the article that currently exists for H5P on the list of H5P activities and how accessible they are. So these are all hyperlinks. Once you have access to the slides, you can just click on these. But for now, we are going to stop sharing for a minute so I can flip over to Pressbooks and we'll do some live demos in Pressbooks. This is just going to take a minute. My computer's being slow today. Okay. Now let's share again. Okay. So for the last few minutes, we're going to look at this. This is a teaching test book. It's just a blank Pressbook that I created so I can do some demoing. So let's start with a few things. So first, let's talk about headings. So this is where you write the chapter title in Pressbooks, is in this box up here. Something to note is that Pressbooks automatically marks this as H1, so heading 1. This is important to note because if I wanted to put a new subtitle here to start a new section in the content itself, we want to start with H2. Otherwise, we will have the chapter title on the same like hierarchy as whatever your content subtitle is. So let's just say this was chapter 1 and the first thing I wanted to say was an introduction. I need to start with heading 2. So by starting with heading 2, this will be heading 1. The screen will understand that this is the chapter title, and then this will get read as the beginning of a section within the content instead of the chapter title. If I were to put this as H1, it'll basically, the screen reader will interpret it as being the same as the chapter title, and so that can get confusing. So make sure you're starting with H2. If you were just say typing contents, let's just say I wrote the word introduction without this being clicked, you can always highlight and do it after the fact. But this is where in that top left corner here of the editing box is where you will get your style tags. And it goes all the way down to heading 6, so H6. Make sure you go in hierarchy. So again, chapter title is H1, but go to H2, subsections within that H3. Don't skip heading style. So if you're starting with heading 2 and you have a subsection within that, do not skip down to heading 4. Make sure you're using heading 3. Make sure you're going in numerical hierarchy. So that's the first thing. Next, let's look at how to do a table. Let's just say I surveyed 8 people about the animals they liked, and I need to display that in my book. So I have this table here. We have the response of either yes or no. We have, do you like cats or do you like dogs? Those are the 2 animals I asked all my survey participants about. The data is only in the 4 cells with numbers in them. The rest of the cells are all headings. So what we want to do is make sure that a screen reader understands that these are headings. So I'm going to start with my columns. I'm going to highlight my columns once the table is in there. Once I have it highlighted. We will now go to cell. So you can see here I went up to the table button. I'm going to go to cell, table cell properties. I will click that. You can manage the width, you can manage the height. This is the dimensions of the cell, that's not the white space. And here on the left column, second thing is cell type. We're going to click it as header cell. And then the scope, we want it to be the entire column. And then we will hit OK. Now, Pressbooks understands, a screener will understand that these are our headings. You can even see visually, it's very minor, but there is bolding to represent those visually as header cells. Now we have our row headings. Do you like cats? Do you like dogs? Again, we highlight them, go to table, cell, table cell properties, header cell, and hit OK. That is how you do table cells. Next, we can try adding an image. So I'm going to do it as if I'm adding an image for the first time. So I'll click on Add Media. I will then select a file. I'm going to pick something at random. Probably it's going to end up being a screenshot from my own personal files. So it's just going to take a minute to go in there. We're going to pick a screenshot at random. We will use the very screenshot from my slideshow. So I've put it in, and now it's just going to take a minute to upload. Now, as you will see, in this right column here, there is a section for alt text. It says to leave empty if the image is purely decorative. I do recommend just writing decorative image. Otherwise, it will still, a screen reader will still see it. So you have your alt text, your caption, description. If I'm being honest, I don't understand what description is. Caption would be something, is a bit of text that would actually appear underneath the image. So if you're doing a much longer image description, I do recommend putting it in the caption. But for now, we can write some alt text. So the grants page of the AtlanticOER website in the top left corner, comma, there is a navy blue button that links to the grant application. And now I've set my alt text, I've got my image, and I can insert it into my chapter. Another thing to consider is, again, we talked about size and resolution. You can edit the size and resolution of images technically within Pressbooks. In general, though, I do find it unreliable. So I recommend that you resize your images outside of Pressbooks and then bring them into Pressbooks once they are the correct size. So we can check how this image will look by hitting preview. And this will show me what this image is going to look like. So as you can see, this image is incredibly small on the page. No one's going to be able to read it. So now that I've tested it and know that, I would personally go back. I would remove this image. I would go into something like Adobe Photoshop. I would resize it there, change the number of pixels, and make sure that would be an appropriate size. So that is everything I had. So thank you everyone for listening. I know that can be a lot of information, can get a bit dense. So I will spend the next 20 minutes answering questions. And Cynthia, I see your hands raised.
So I actually put the question in the chat as well, but so back to that H1, H2, whatever. If
Yeah.
I'm creating the book in Word,
Yeah.
so you said the chapter is in H1 in Pressbooks. Does that mean in Word I should be using H1 for the chapter titles and not the title style?
That's how I was taught, yes. I was taught to not use title when I was learning. This is specific to web as well, because often the title is interpreted as the actual title of the web page. So the web page will always be seen as the title. This is, again, based on what I've been taught in terms of web specifically. And so because of that, if you are preparing your content outside of Pressbooks and going to bring it in, keep that in mind when you're doing this work, because the H1 tags, anything that you import will get, like those tags, all of the HTML behind the content will get transferred as well. And we need to make sure it transfers cleanly.
Thanks.
No problem.
Is there any possibility you might be able to demonstrate using MathJax to put a formula in?
I will copy and paste the one I have, just because I'm no math person. I'm not gonna be able to come with one on the top off the top of my head, but absolutely we can try one. This will just take me a minute to get back to that page, and then we can certainly try it. Yeah, it's unfortunate that LaTeX isn't screen reader friendly as of right now, and that we do have to kind of do these more convoluted methods of getting things in, but it is doable. So let me just copy and paste the syntax so I do not make a mistake. And then I'll share again and we can go back into this book. So let's share screen. So first we need to start by turning off the plugin that does LaTeX. So we need to go into plugins. It's on this left bar here. And you'll see there's different ones. Okay, Quick LaTeX is currently off. We would have to activate it. So we just want to double check. For a while in Pressbooks, this was actually automatically turned on. And sometimes I find it is automatic or not, depending on the current update. So we just want to go into the plugins, double check, Quick LaTeX, this one down here. It's not on. That's what we want. So now we're going to go into organize. We go into the chapter. Let's just say we're putting it in chapter 1. For folks who are wondering why what I was doing earlier didn't save, it's because isn't here anymore. It's because I didn't save. But you would literally copy and paste it in. Make sure I get rid of that. And then because we have Quick LaTeX off, this should work. If not, you can always try putting in the text, but let's preview it. Always make sure to preview everything, make sure it's working, but this should work because Quick LaTeX is off. Yep, you can see I've got Quick LaTeX off and you can see the formula is there. E to the power of I pi plus 1 equals 0. So the key part to take away from this bit of syntax is that you need the square bracket LaTeX and then the square bracket / LaTeX surrounding whatever LaTeX you've done. That is what allows Pressbooks to know that there is LaTeX present and that it needs to convert it. Oh gosh. Any other questions?
So if you already had the image embedded, so let's say we're retroactively going back and make our document,
Yeah.
our book accessible.
Yeah.
Do I just click on it and that editing thing will show up on the side?
Yeah, so normally what you do is if you like click on the image, here, why don't I throw an image in there and I can show you, but essentially when you click on the image, there'll be a bunch of like different visual tools that show up in a box above it. And one of them is a pencil icon and that's your edit. So I'm going to quickly throw in an image, just a random one that won't have alt text, and then I'll show everyone. Media. I'm going to get rid of the alt text in the image so I can then show this. Insert into chapter. Okay. Let me share my screen again now that it's in there. So I've got my image in here. I did not put alt text in it. That's okay. I click on my image, and as you can see, these are the different alignment options. So this is align left, center the image, or align it right, or you don't care about alignment, but we're going to go to this pencil icon here. That's the edit button. And you'll see immediately image details pop up and your alt text is here. And so we can start typing alt text. So, and page of the Atlantic website in the top left corner. There.
So the first sentence is basically naming the page, and the second sentence is describing the information on the page.
Yeah. Typically this is the formula I follow, which is quick description of what this item is as a whole, and then a sentence where you're talking about a key feature or key takeaway. That is a good formula. I find it works really well. Again, this is a very non-detailed image where, we're not trying to describe the whole thing because it's not, say, a figure that might exist in like a lot of detail in a textbook. So this is what I follow. But yeah, that's how I like to do it. And then maybe I'm just going to finish this alt text and I'll show you how to save it. In the bottom right corner here, there's a red button that says update. You click it. Now the alt text is in there. And then let's just go to this preview again, and I can show you all what Wave does. So if you see here, I've got my different browser plugins. Wave, that accessibility checker, is this one that's got the fancy sine curve looking thing that is a W. So what I can do is I'll click on Wave. It's just going to take a minute because it's analyzing the web page. And then this report shows up on the side here. So we have 0 errors, which means there's 0 big errors. There's 1 contrast error, which I'm sure it will show us if we actually looked at this in more detail. 5 features, which are like good elements and a bunch of structural elements. So you can see here, we've got like our H1 tags. We've got the different tags. We've got our H2 tags that it's highlighting. And then we should be able at some point to find the color contrast issue because it will show up somewhere. Here you can see that there's an image. It confirms that we have alt text that says logo for AtlanticOER Pressbooks Network, which is great. But this is the kind of report you can generate. So I find it really useful because sometimes it will just catch things that, I didn't think of, or sometimes I think I saved my alt text and then I realize that I forgot to hit that update button. But if I run it through here, it'll catch it for me.
And does it allow you to actually make the change in what you're seeing, or do you have to go back and remember what it told you?
You have to go back. Because remember that this is not the editing page for Pressbooks. We have to then go back into the editing interface and then do it there. Yeah, I find Wave just incredibly helpful, especially just in terms of catching things. Again, if I forgot to save something, or if I thought something saved, but like I did something funky and it didn't save properly, anything like that, it's just really good for catching those. Or if I misclicked and put the wrong heading hierarchy. So let's just say that I had a subheading here. We can see that this is heading 1. And let's just say here I meant to put an H2 tag and misclicked and hit H1, and there was a subtitle here. It will catch that, and I can say, oh, that's not what it is meant to me. I can go fix that. So I find it incredibly helpful just for catching those human errors that we all make.
So let's say it's that you had that one contrast error. Sorry.
Yes.
Can you just click on that and it'll show you where on the page that is? Because I was trying to figure out where those errors were on that page you were showing me on Wave.
You can hit view details. And then once you're into the view details, that's where you'll be able to find it. So it will take you to the error itself. Sometimes it is like things beyond our control. So in this case, as I suspected, it is just it's the red on white that I believe is the issue.
Is it going to show on the screen here?
Oh, I stopped sharing my screen. That's an accident. But it will show up. So right now, like you can also pick which ones you want to see, which is really great. So yeah, we're in the details tab. We can say, I only want to see this detail, or I want to see the features as well. Like you can pick which things you want to see. Again, I really like having the structural elements listed because again, sometimes I just make a mistake and put the wrong structural element and I want to be able to see that. I'm not seeing the color contrast showing up, but if I had to wager a guess, it's the red on white. If I was guessing. Yeah, no, I find it's incredibly helpful just for catching simple errors.
Thanks.
Of course. Any other questions?
Oh, can Wave be used in any browser, or is it specifically better for in one browser than another?
I've only ever tried it personally in Google Chrome. That is the browser I use. There are versions of it that do exist for other browsers, but I cannot personally speak to how well they work just because I've never tried them in other browsers. But generally, this is a good one that I would recommend. It should generate the same reports in all browsers. I don't know why it wouldn't, so.
Thanks.
Any final
Any
questions?
other questions?
Any
other questions? Thank you very much, Alexandra. I learned some things that I didn't realize. I didn't realize that the chapter was an H1. Apparently, that wasn't intuitive.
No, it's not. And that's why I always do demos of Pressbooks, because some of it is things I think that we all know theoretically, but we don't realize the actual practice in Pressbooks and how funky some of it is. And also, unfortunately, Pressbooks does not have the best documentation in terms of accessibility. So I know I'm very aware that there aren't a lot of resources out there about some of these things. So.
I'm just going to turn off the recording. And just a reminder that the